So I am talking about the relationship between Buddhism and liberalism today. Um, I'm not going to try to convince you of the truth of Buddhism in any metaphysical sense, but rather I want to make the claim that Buddhist philosophy, and specifically Buddhist ethics, can help us understand the core ideas of liberalism and help us to defend liberalism. And further, that Buddhist insights can help us understand why illiberalism is appealing to so many people and why it, I think, necessarily leads to suffering. Liberalism creates suffering for the illiberal themselves and then for society when they try to impose illiberal systems or values on it. And then finally, I think Buddhist insights and some ideas from Buddhist practice can help us be better liberals by strengthening our commitment to liberal principles, and also can help us thrive, be happier, be more content within a liberal society. So I'll give a very brief overview of Buddhist ethics to give some context to the rest of the talk. So the Buddha, who was a rough contemporary of the Oh, I can do my best. I'm not a loud guy. Okay, so the Buddha was a rough contemporary of the pre-Socratic Greeks, and he set out to solve the problem of suffering, or the Pali word is dukkha, which gets translated in English as suffering, but a better translation is something more like unease, dis-ease, discontentment, stress, that feeling. The origin of the word is actually a wheel that rubs. So there's just something that's slightly off and uncomfortable. And the story goes that he was raised a wealthy prince. There's different versions of it. And his family kept all of the bad things in the world from him. And then he was out in the town, in the city, and witnessed old age, sickness, and death for the first time, and realized that these are inevitabilities. All of us will grow old, all of us will get sick, all of us will eventually die, and that this was a cause for suffering in the lives of the people who experienced it and in the lives of the people who anticipate experiencing it. And so he set out, he left his family, ran off into the countryside to try to solve this problem. And specifically what he wanted to find was a happiness that was deathless. So this is a happiness that wouldn't end, but importantly, I think this part's really critical for the relationship to liberalism, a happiness that didn't require struggling with others, and a happiness that caused no one any harm. This is not happiness at the expense of others. And the answer that he arrived at, which is framed in the way that a physician might diagnose and then cure an ailment, was the Four Noble Truths. So first one is the diagnosis, is that life contains this kind of suffering. It's not that life is nothing but this kind of suffering, but rather that it's a constant feature of just being the human experience. The second is the cause. So what causes the ailment? And he identified it as ignorance of the fundamentally impermanent nature of all phenomena, including ourselves. Everything is always in a state of change. Everything is the result of causes, and if those causes go away, then the thing itself will go away or will change. Nothing lasts forever. But the cause of our suffering, then, is that we don't accept that truth. We're either ignorant of it or we refuse to accept it, and so instead we engage in clinging We hold on to so this everything in it, like the people in our lives, the possessions that we have, the status that we have, the very identity that we have is impermanent. We'll lose it at some point, or it will change from its current state, but we cling to it as if it were permanent. And that clinging causes suffering and discontentment because in the back of our minds, we know this is going to go away. Or aversion. We don't like the way this other thing is, and we push that away from us. We refuse to acknowledge, we refuse to accept. The third noble truth is that it is possible to undo these causes, that suffering can be cured by if we've identified the causes. If we take away the causes, then we'll take away the suffering. And then the fourth noble truth is the prescription. It's the course of treatment, which is the Eightfold Path, which is a method to cultivate the perspectives and the virtues and the skillfulness needed to achieve it. And so the Eightfold Path is right view, right intention, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration. And that word right can sometimes better be described as skillful. It's doing these things well in the right way, in a way that is conducive to happiness, is wholesome instead of unwholesome. Finally, to help tie this further into liberalism, Buddhist practice doesn't begin by just understanding this. I can describe impermanence to you, but that's not enough to end the suffering because we have these ingrained habits of mind and perspective, and it's something, it takes a lot of effort to really understand impermanence and undo the clinging, grasping, and ignorance. But we need space for that. The goal is to stop harming ourselves, to stop harming others. And so we start with a set of precepts, of ethical rules that essentially don't do these things. At the very least, just knock this stuff off, and that will then give you space to develop the understanding, the practice, and so on. And the first two of these are really important for liberalism, but the first two are refrain from killing or harming others, all sentient beings it's applied to. The second one sometimes gets translated as refrain from stealing, but it's more accurately don't take what is not freely given to you. Refrain from harmful sensual misconduct. So this can be sexual misconduct, but other forms of, so this would be kind of harmful hedonism. Refrain from wrong speech. This is harmful, divisive, dishonest speech. And finally, refrain from intoxicants. And the reason intoxicants is because there's a story in the early Pali Canon of a monk who was given the choice by a villager to either, I think it goes, either kill an animal, sleep with the villager's wife, or drink alcohol. And the monk, thinking about it, says, well, the one that seems the least bad is I'll drink some alcohol. And so he got really drunk, and while he was drunk, he killed an animal and slept with the neighbor's wife. And so that it is don't take intoxicants that cause heedlessness, that would cause you to basically forget about all of the other precepts. So that's kind of the broad overview of Buddhism, and then there are methods for meditative practices, shifts in perspective, behaviors to kind of bring you along this path. Liberalism, what does this have to do with liberalism? Well, if we take a step back, the Eightfold Path points to two things. One is non-harm. So we can't end suffering if we are inflicting it on ourselves and on others. And part of the on others is because you might say, well, I just really enjoy hurting people, right? Or I enjoy stealing. These things don't seem to cause me suffering. And And the argument is that being virtuous, being ethical, brings a degree of peace. If we are unethical, if we're dishonest, we're constantly worried that someone's going to find out about those lies. If we are harmful to others, we're constantly worried that that's going to come back on us. And that worry, that anxiety, makes it harder to kind of have the mental space to cultivate virtues in a better, stronger, more wholesome perspective. And so we need to just stop that stuff, like the easy stuff. Stop killing, stop stealing, stop being dishonest and divisive, and so on, to give ourselves space to then develop further. And then the Eightfold Path points to recognizing and accepting impermanence, because ultimately the source of this suffering is that we are insisting, consciously or unconsciously, that the world and our nature be something that they cannot be. We're demanding a reality that contradicts the actual state of reality. Liberalism, to give a rough definition of it, is respect for rights and equal dignity of others. So not placing your interests above, yourself above, but we all are on an equal moral level and acting that way. That's non-harm, right? That's not killing, that's refraining from stealing, and so on. And then liberalism is diversity and dynamism. A liberal society is an open society. An open society means open is the opposite of grasping or clinging, right? It's a society where we're going to let people be, and let them be themselves, let them discover themselves, let them try things. You know, Buddhism began in this kind of radical act of self-authorship and experiments in living, right? Because he said, I had this one life, but I'm going to drop out, as many ascetics did in ancient India. I'm going to kind of drop out of society and go off and try. And he tried a whole bunch of things. Like he was not the only person out there trying to solve this problem of suffering. And there were people who thought the way to do it was extreme self-mortification. So they'd starve themselves and beat themselves and inflict suffering, and that somehow that would clear it out. And he tried that and it didn't work. There are other people who argue that the way to end suffering was to just indulge in all of the pleasures of life. That didn't work. Finding that other path required breaking from, trying things new that weren't what everyone else was doing. And a society that enables that, because all of us are different, is going to be one that is diverse. You know, all of us have different interests, different preferences. We like different kinds of music. We have different visions of how we want our lives to play out. And a liberal society enables us to pursue those. And that results in diversity. But it's also going to be dynamic, right? Like it's not, diversity is a snapshot in time. At any given moment, we can say, like, what are the interests of the people in this room right now? But if we regathered in a year, the same people, and I asked what your interests were, it would be different. You might have shifted to something else. You might have discovered something new. An open society is one that is diverse and constantly changing. And that's impermanence. And I should note that this is both social and economic liberalism represented by these two principles. Social liberalism, we kind of just talked about, right? Like people are free to pursue, to self-author, to choose their own lives and live them how they see fit, and to find others who they share those interests with. But economic liberalism fits this bill too. What is a market? What is a market economy? A market economy is one where we respect the rights of others in the form of property rights, where we respect that second precept. If I sell you something and I sell it to you at a price that you think is, we mutually have agreed to this exchange, then we each have taken something from the other that was freely given, right? We each freely gave up the money for the product or service. And markets are tremendously diverse and dynamic. Markets work because each person is producing different kinds of goods that meet the different preferences of different people. And an open market is one where you can enter in and you can come up with new products or new ways of doing things or new services. And you might discover a better way to do it that completely replaces the old. Innovation, technological change, or it might just be tastes and preferences. There are musical genres that top the charts for a decade and now no one really listens to them anymore. And that's not that music is more innovative or it's, you know, I think the best music objectively was released when I was in high school, but that's, it would be hard to say like there's progress in music, right? It's just preferences change, and that's great. And so a market, and then what a market does is, so if understanding non-harm and impermanence is how we create happiness for ourselves or undo suffering, markets achieve happiness for a much larger number of people and undo suffering, raise people out of poverty, solve medical problems, and so on by harnessing those powers of non-harm, property rights and exchange, and diversity and dynamism in the form of innovation. They create prosperity by acknowledging these two facts of reality and taking advantage of that. I want to note here, it might be tempting to say, but Buddhists aren't capitalists. Buddhist monks, at least in the Pali tradition that I have the most affinity for and I'm the most familiar with, the early Buddhism, and then kind of exists now in the Theravada tradition of, say, Sri Lanka, are prohibited from touching money or accepting money. And they get their food by begging. They take their alms bowl out and wander around the village and accept food from the villagers. They're certainly not market participants and merchants and so on. But it's important to note that those rules apply to monks, right? Like Buddhism doesn't tell everyone to be a monk. Most of the Buddhists at the time, people who listened to the teachings of the Buddha when he was still alive, were not monks. And the early texts are filled with dialogues with lay practitioners. And those rules don't apply. In fact, the fifth of the Eightfold Path is right livelihood. So it acknowledges that we have to earn a living somehow. And the texts are full of examples of the Buddha talking to merchants, wealthy householders, and he never tells them it's wrong to earn a living, or to be rich. In fact, there's one of the suttas, which are these early dialogue texts, mentions being wealthy as like a reward for good past deeds, not as something that's like inherently bad. But it is right livelihood. And what that means is that if you're going to be a participant in the markets, if you're going to accumulate wealth, it needs to be done in an ethical way. You get rich by harming people. And there's a list that shows up sometimes where there's prohibited stuff, like don't sell weapons, don't sell intoxicants that cause heedlessness, don't sell slaves, like harmful activities, which is perfectly compatible with being good market actors. And further, monks take a vow of poverty. They're not allowed to own anything but their alms bowl and I think it says 2 robes. But there's nothing that says that a wealthy person has to give up all of their wealth. The guidelines that show up in the text look something more like, I think one version of it is you take a quarter of your wealth and use it for your own enjoyment. You take half of it and invest it in the work, so reinvest it into your business, your dealings, and take a quarter of it and put it away for bad times. There's another version that shows up which is more take a quarter of it and enjoy it, take a quarter of it and use it for the benefit of your family. A quarter of it goes to kind of benefiting the world and the servants, and then the final is give it to the monks. So again, this is just, these comport with kind of an ethical use of wealth. If you're tremendously wealthy, supporting charity is better than not, or other ways that help others. So liberalism then, if liberalism is just non-harm and impermanence at this kind of social level, market level, then liberalism is good because it better comports with the reality of an impermanent world. And it works because recognizing, accepting, and embracing impermanence and non-harm are the path to happiness, and liberalism is doing that at the social and economic levels. And so the Eightfold Path, by helping us to understand and accept impermanence, makes us more content and happy within liberalism's dynamic and diverse world. So illiberalism, then. Illiberalism is the insistence on permanence in social and economic patterns. So if impermanence is inevitable, and if diversity and dynamism are inevitable at the social level, then a system that denies those will necessarily fail. Liberalism is clinging, insistence on permanence, and its aversion to change. So in a Buddhist context, if the 3 poisons, as they're called, the 3 sources of suffering are clinging, aversion, and ignorance of impermanence, a liberalism is clinging, aversion, and ignorance or refusal to accept impermanence. And that leads to suffering. People in liberal regimes generally do not do as well as people in liberal and open societies. There's the philosopher Robert Nozick had this idea of liberty upsets patterns. And what he meant is, so imagine a lot of like socialism is we can have a patterned distribution of wealth, or a lot of extreme versions of like social conservatism is we can have a patterned society. This is the hierarchy. These are the people who are going to be on top. These are the traditional roles, different categories of people are going to play within this. It's a pattern that we can sketch out. And what Nozick said is, pick any pattern you want. So I'll use his Wilt Chamberlain famous example. Wilt Chamberlain was the best basketball player in the world at the time Nozick was writing his book Anarchy, State, Utopia. And he said, imagine that you think the ultimate, like the most just distribution of wealth is everyone has the same amount. And so we wave a wand and we make that the case. Everybody has $10 including Wilt Chamberlain. Now we introduce liberty into the system. People want to see Wilt Chamberlain play basketball. He's very, very good at it. It's a lot of fun to watch him play it. And Wilt says, you know, there's a lot of people who want to watch me play basketball. I'm going to charge $1 to see me play. Everyone's got their $10, and 100 people say, I would love to see you play basketball. It would make me happy. I am more than happy to give you $1. Well, now Wilt has $110, and 100 people have $9. And so we no longer have our pattern. We had our perfectly just pattern distribution. But as soon as we introduced liberty and people began to act upon it, and act in ways where every single person in those exchanges thought they were better off because of them. You know, they thought that getting to see Wilt Chamberlain play basketball was worth more than $1 to them. And Wilt felt that getting the $1 was worth more than whatever costs there were to him playing basketball. That pattern's been upset because of liberty. And that will happen no matter what pattern. Traditional gender roles say, well, if people are free, there's going to be some people who say, I don't want to live that role. I want to try something else. I'm happier doing this other thing. And now the pattern's gone. But committing then to those patterns, so insisting on this permanence, clinging to the everybody has $10, or clinging to the traditional gender roles, then creates suffering. It creates suffering for the people who are not, now they can't get to see Wilt Chamberlain play basketball, or now they can't live the life they wanted because they're forced into this other role. But it also creates suffering for the illiberal doing the clinging, because even the most authoritarian regime is dynamic in some way. Or even the most authoritarian regime, that ruler is constantly worried that they might get overthrown, that things might change. The people at the top of the hierarchy are worried that their status might decline, and so they're constantly on the lookout for anything that might threaten, which is a source of constant anxiety. That all sounds bad, so why then is a liberalism appealing? Everywhere we see people insisting upon it. There's a question up on the board about if liberalism's so great, why isn't everybody a liberal? Illiberalism is a habit of thought and perspective. And it's a habit that forms because first, it is easier to be reactive than accepting. If there's something you don't like, our inclination is to try to end it, to try to push it away, because we don't like it, right? Accepting something you don't like means that thing you don't like is still there. So we have to, it is more challenging. Reaction is more tempting than acceptance. If we like something, we want it to last, right? I'm at the top of the hierarchy in the current situation. That's pretty great. Or I'm financially doing very well in the current situation. That's great. I don't want that to go away, right? That's perfectly understandable. Or if we don't like something, we want it to stop. But then what we do, because we're suffering when that thing changes or when that thing persists longer than we'd like it to, is we blame the suffering caused by our own clinging and aversion, not on the fact of our clinging and aversion, but rather on the fact of the change or the presence of the difference. So if I get angry about something, one of the Buddhist practices with anger is if you're angry, which is this intense and uncomfortable, it's not pleasurable to be angry, is to take a moment and look. We tend to think that the anger is being caused by this person cut me off in traffic, which seems to happen a lot in Delhi. But the anger lasts longer than the being cut off. And that happens instantly and it's done, right? But the anger, and sometimes we just sit there and we feed that anger. You're like, as soon as the anger starts to subside, you're like, oh, I remember when that guy cut me off. And then you just you just keep giving fuel to it. And that guy's no longer, hey, he doesn't know who you are. He's gone, right? You're never going to see him again. But you keep feeding this. And so the suffering from that is caused by your reaction as opposed to the thing itself. And then the leader, the populist leader, the illiberal leader, the socialist, so on, comes along, and rather than saying, hey, in an open and free society, people are going to do things that you don't like. They're going to live lifestyles that you wouldn't choose, or perhaps even make you uncomfortable. Or a market economy is going to bring all these benefits, but it also might mean that your business goes under because someone else comes up with something else, or competition, or the product you were selling, we've had an innovation and nobody wants your thing, or tastes change. You were making this kind of music and now the kids want this kind of music. And it's easier to see those, when you lose your business, that feels very acute and real to you versus kind of the broader prosperity that the whole system brings. And so the illiberal leader comes along, or the illiberal ideology, you come across it in some corner of the internet, and it promises to stop it. It tells you the reason you're suffering is not because of your reaction to the liberalism, that you could choose to stop. You don't have to react that way, but rather it's the liberalism itself. That's the problem. Elect me, change the system, pass these regulations, reorder the economy, and I'll put a stop to, I'll make the world permanent again, or I'll take it back to the way you wanted it to be, and then I will fix it that way. Dynamism will end, diversity will end, we'll have uniformity and stasis, and you'll be happy. And that's a pretty good pitch, right? Like that's, you want to believe that's true because that seems like an easy fix, versus the liberal, who has a harder time making their pitch. So there's a television show 20 years ago in the United States that was very popular called The West Wing. It was about a presidential administration. And it was a Democratic presidential administration. And I remember watching it, and it was a very good show, and thinking, you really couldn't make a libertarian West Wing. And the reason you couldn't do that is because every episode was structured around there's the president and people bust into his office and there's these problems in the world. And then over the course of 42 minutes, because of commercials, he and his staff have come up with some policy that has solved it. And it's very exciting and dramatic, and there's a victory at the end. Whereas if it were a libertarian, he would just say, I can't do anything about that. Or, yes, that's a problem, but leave it alone and the market or emergent orders will fix it. And that would make for a very dull television show. And it also makes for a harder pitch, because if people are feeling that suffering right now, the pitch of, actually liberalism is great, you should get over it, and if you let the system work, it will better you in the long term, is a much harder pitch than I will make this thing stop. Of course, it doesn't work for all the reasons we discussed, which just compounds the suffering. But then you just blame, well, we didn't do enough of liberalism, right? Or I was angry at these guys, but now it turns out I need to be angry at these guys too. Fortunately, I think, Buddhism gives us some ways to circumvent this cycle. And one way to think about that is to think of liberalism as a perspective. It's a way that we see the world. Ethics in general is a way that we see the world. It is to live well, to live ethically, to live morally, requires understanding these rules, right? There are moral rules and so on, but it also requires seeing situations in the right way with the right perspective. So it might be that you have all of the right moral rules in your head and you're committed to following them, but you simply don't notice the situations where they apply. You might not notice that other people are suffering because you're lost in your own world, or you might tell yourself a story about how this isn't actually. There's a study, there's a paper that came out years and years ago about philosophy professors in the US. And the question was, are professional moral philosophers, so people who have a PhD in moral philosophy and have dedicated their career to moral philosophy, are they actually more moral than anyone else, right? And so the way they set up this experiment was they went to a philosophers conference, moral philosophy, and they set up a table with, I think it was donuts or cookies or something like that, and they put up a sign that said, if you want one of these, if you want a donut, it's 25 cents. Please put 25 cents into this bin. And it's wrong to steal. That's a fairly uncontroversial moral rule, right? And they tested how many donuts disappeared over the course of the day and how many coins were in the bin at the end. And ran this elsewhere, and it turned out moral philosophers, if I remember the results correctly, it's not just that they were no more moral than anyone else, but they were slightly less moral. Not hugely less moral, but enough that you could measure it. And the reason was because one of the things that a lifetime of training in moral philosophy allows you to do is, given the situation, you can probably come up with some pretty compelling reasons why actually taking the donut is okay in this instance, right? You're better at reasoning your way to the conclusion that you want versus just kind of feeling it at it's wrong to take the donut and not give the 25 cents. So one of the things that Buddhism offers, one of the techniques that it has, is this idea that there are barriers to kind of cultivating this perspective, the hindrances. And so the hindrances are sensory desire, ill will, sloth or torpor. If you're really tired, meditative practice, you just fall asleep. Restlessness and worry, and then doubt. Doubt being you're not convinced that you're on the right path, that this is worth doing, and so on. And it offers a set of perspectives, values, attitudes to overcome some of these. And these are called the sublime attitudes. And there's 4 of them. There's goodwill, there's compassion, there's empathetic joy, which is that feeling of delight in someone else's delight. an equanimity. So not flying off the handle, not overreacting to things. And I think we can look at illiberalism in the context of these four, like kind of populist, illiberal, reactionary movements tend to be grounded in ill will. I don't like those people over there. I don't like those people. Those people have the wrong religion. Those people have the wrong skin color. Those people speak a language I don't understand. They want something different than me. And you just stew in ill will towards everybody but your narrow group. Compassion, tend to be low on compassion because compassion is recognizing and wanting to end the suffering of others. But a lot of illiberalism is, I'm mad at these guys and I want them to hurt. You know, there's the rise of Donald Trump in the US, a lot of attempts to try to figure out why this is and why he's so appealing, because he's boorish, he's not very smart, his policies are all over the place, but he has an appeal. And part of that appeal is he hates the people I hate, and he wants to hurt the people that I hate. And if he said that if he's elected, he will hurt the people that I want to hurt. It's not a position of compassion. Empathetic joy, the opposite of empathetic joy is jealousy, is envy, is like, I see this person over there happy, and I resent that. Or it makes me uncomfortable. Versus, you know, that feeling, I think that the easiest way to like explain it, or the version of it, is if you see, you know, someone you love, your parent, then your child, or someone in your family succeed at something. You know, you're watching them accomplish. They're competing in a sport and doing very well, or they've produced something or had some accomplishment. You feel delight in that, and it's not a delight of like ownership. It's not like, I'm happy because that's my kid that did that, right? And therefore it's like reflects well on me or something. It is genuinely an empathetic joy. You are happy for them. Because they are happy, it is making you happy. And that's really challenging for in a liberal society, because a lot of the happiness that you see in a liberal society is diverse. It is people who are able to go off and live the life that they always wanted, but it's not the life that you would have chosen. And so you resent them. Their happiness can't be authentic because it's not the kind I would have chosen, or it somehow is harmful, or I'm just mad about it. And then equanimity. Politics gets people pretty angry. And anger can be appropriate. There are times that when anger can be righteous and good, and when you see injustices in the world, being blasé about them, just kind of detached, it doesn't matter, is not the right approach. But politics encourages us to get overly angry, and then to encourage anger and feed the anger and hold on, like the guy who cut you off. That's basically all of politics for a lot of people, is just what's something I can be angry about now. And so, but what's fortunate is, I think one of the insights of Buddhism is that these sublime attitudes are trainable. We can get better at them. You can cultivate these feelings. There are meditative practices, metta meditation, as an example, where you create in yourself the feeling of goodwill, the wish of goodwill, which is not, I love everybody. That's unrealistic. It would be weird to like love everybody equally. It's fine to love your own children or your parents more than some random person on the street, but it's goodwill. It's wanting everybody to be happy, to find happiness. Even bad people, right? Wishing bad things upon bad people is not healthy. It doesn't cause the bad things to happen, first off. And so it's just stewing in negativity. But a bad person, you can wish them happiness because you can say, like, I wish this person is clearly, their badness is causing suffering for them, even if they're not aware of it. And they are caught up in clinging and aversion and ignorance. And I have goodwill for them in the sense that I wish that they could find happiness. And so you can meditate and cultivate these feelings. You can bring these feelings to mind, sit there and kind of wish goodwill to people, to the world, to everyone, and practice, because one of the really important insights is that much of the way we view the world, much of our values are habits. If you spend all your time angry, it's easier to be angry. And you will just, your natural reaction is to get angry. But if you spend your time trying to cultivate goodwill and compassion and empathetic joy such that you're experiencing what it's like to have those feelings, it's easier to have those feelings. And it's much more pleasurable. Like metta meditation feels really good. And so we can shift that. And so that's one of the ways that if feelings of ill will and resentment are causes of a liberalism, then we can kind of strengthen our commitment to liberalism, and in a way that feels awfully nice and makes us happier. So Buddhism, to sum up, Buddhism gives us a path and some tools, so concepts, understanding, practices, that do three things simultaneously. The first is makes us better liberal citizens. So we have a deeper commitment to these foundational principles, non-harm, dynamism, diversity, of a liberal society. And the deeper our commitment, then, this is the second thing, the stronger our liberalism, because we will be less inclined to deviate from it if we really are committed to it. We'll be less willing to give into a liberalism in those moments where something happens that really upsets us. And it helps us, these insights help us to love living in a liberal society even more. That as you internalize these things, as you find ways to feel goodwill towards diverse others, to gain empathetic joy from seeing that this amazing pluralistic society where everybody has wildly different interests and loves and desires and so on, but they all are able, through the prosperity that markets generate, through the freedom that social liberalism affords us, through the experimentation that results from this, of people trying out different ways to live. And you can say, I would never want that lifestyle, but man, it's amazing that that person can find that level of happiness doing that thing. And so if the world is necessarily going to be dynamic and diverse, if we can take delight in that as opposed to just grimacing and tolerating it, then we'll be less likely to run away from liberalism, but we'll also just be happier in the world as it is around us. So again, if liberalism, if Buddhism is correct in these core insights, then an ethical person, someone who relates to others in the correct way, has the correct values, lives a flourishing life, will be a liberal. And a genuinely liberal person, someone who understands these principles of liberalism and embraces them, will be an ethical one. I wanted to close with a quick coda, though. There's a question up on that board of how do we get the ideas in this room out of this room and into the world? And one way to answer that is get better at making arguments for these ideas. Strengthen your arguments and win those arguments with others. And that's good. Being better at defending your ideas in a debate is important. But it's not all of it. Reach matters, right? You want to get these ideas out. There's not that many of us here. Each of you can go and talk to another person. That'll double the number who have heard these ideas. But there's a lot more people than double the number in this room. And so other mechanisms, we live in this amazing world of communication technologies, of TikTok, and I'm really active on Threads and email and blogging, and and figuring out how to use that, craft compelling messages and then disseminate them broadly. That's important, but it's not all of it. And so I think one important part of getting these ideas out of this room is to recognize that each one of us, each person who values these ideas and values them in a way where you want to see them spread in the world because you think they genuinely make the world better, not just for you, but for everybody else. To view yourself as an ambassador of these ideas. Right? These ideas aren't free-floating in the world. Anyone who encounters them for the first time encounters them from someone, whether that's you directly or something you've written or a video you've appeared in or a post you've made. And the ideas will be judged by you, right? The people who are interacting with you have an opinion of you, and then they will judge the ideas based in part on how good your arguments are, but in part on how they judge you. And so this just gives me an opportunity to bring up my favorite passage in the whole of the Pali Canon is thousands and thousands of pages of dialogues. And then that doesn't even include the Tibetan canon, which is thousands more, and the Chinese canon, which is thousands more. There's a lot of these early writings. But my favorite one, my favorite teaching, comes from the Upada Sutta. And the Buddha had this attendant, Ananda. And Ananda was talking to some people, because occasionally Ananda would give teachings when the Buddha was meditating or tired or whatever. And he tells these people, he says, this is half of the holy life. Having admirable people as friends, companions, and colleagues. And the Buddha jumps in and corrects him. And so he says, don't say that, Ananda. Don't say that. Having admirable people as friends, companions, and colleagues is actually the whole of the holy life. And so that's my answer to that, is you can build up a huge amount of knowledge. And we got really interesting stuff from Tom and Trudy. And you can have the reach, right? But be admirable while doing it. Be the kind of person who others look up to, who when they hear these ideas, which they may have come in with misconceptions and preconceptions about them, like, oh, free market economics is just about kind of selfishness and greed and the rich just not wanting to pay taxes or not wanting to have their businesses regulated, self-interest and so on. Or they might have just coming from other perspectives. You should be the kind of person where someone who hears you making these arguments, their reaction isn't, oh, this confirms that these are just the arguments made by callous or selfish or greedy people, but rather, I may not agree, but I have enough respect for this person. I look up to this person. This is the kind of person who I want to associate as an admirable friend, companion, or colleague, that there must be something to them. Otherwise, a person who's like that wouldn't be arguing this. And so, yeah, I'll end there. Like, it is important to be a knowledgeable liberal. It's important to be a well-communicating liberal, but it is just as important to be an admirable liberal. Thank you. Questions, objections?
Not an objection, just wanted to say this felt like a really amazing therapy session. I don't know how to do it.
Thank you. Yes.
Just had a question. So, Friedman would say that perhaps the, moral side of business is that it's a business in the first place, right? It doesn't per se owe anything to society, apart from being a business and providing employment. So you would have corporate social responsibilities and these things on one side. You would argue that maybe that's not really necessary. And I kind of agree with that. I just wanted to ask you, what does Buddhism have to say for, the moral side of businesses as far as whether they owe something to society?
Yeah, so two things, I think. First, there was an acknowledgement at the time, going back to the right livelihood, that, so in Jainism, which was an influence on Buddhist ethics and on the Buddha, that the primary moral way of earning a living, the upstanding, admirable way of earning a living, was to be a merchant. And the reason that it was admirable compared to other ways was because it was the only way that was fully peaceful. It was non-harming because you were selling to someone who wanted to buy, and they were buying from you because they wanted to. And so the very act of commerce and exchange was a moral act compared to other ways, the tax collector, the bandit, and so on. So I think that's part of it, is that just the very act of being a business that acts as a free market participant, as opposed to rent-seeking or underhanded moves or other non-ideal activities, is itself a praiseworthy way of being. But I think the flip side of it is a business is just a group of individuals. It could just be one, right? But it's a group of people. And those people have responsibilities, duties, ethical practices outside of the business. And so we can say, yeah, when you're engaged in the act of business itself, maybe your focus should be entirely on profit maximization in a way that doesn't violate other ethical principles. You maximize profits by selling poison to people. That's not a good way to go about it. But if you're not, so like non-harmful market activity, non-harmful profit maximization, your focus is just on that. But you're a person outside of that too. And so I would say you then have other responsibilities. So if you are fortunate enough to have found a lot of success, try to be helpful. Try to find ways to enjoy your success. Don't feel guilty about enjoying your success, but if there are ways for you to help others who have not been as fortunate, and sometimes that's more market activity. Giving jobs to people is tremendously helpful. And maybe you're doing it because you're going to get more profits out of their labor than you're paying in their labor, but it still is you're helping someone hugely. But it can be other activities as well. So I would just say the business activity should be done ethically, and then as just a participant, a human sharing the world with other humans, you should also look for ways to help.
Do you think that most people who are liberals have not consciously meditated on these ideas, right? It's
Sure.
and so, and also most people who are liberal are themselves prosperous and live in prosperous societies. There's a famous saying, don't tell a hungry man to meditate. And so, to some extent, are these ideas just like, do they just follow from prosperity? And so if we're like, once you experience abundance,
Mhm.
it's easier to embrace these ideas. And so if we want a society where people have these ideas, we want an abundant society first.
I think it's challenging to have an abundant society without these ideas to some degree. Like there are historically rich societies that were profoundly illiberal, but those were usually just, we have a lot of mineral wealth we're selling, and the wealth was very concentrated among. But I think there is this like feedback loop of, if you have seen the success that these ideas, then it's easier to say, sign me up, versus if you've never seen any of the success of this, someone comes along and says, well, here's a better way. There's a degree of imagination required in that, and not just imagination, but faith, because even if things are bad, we still have a bias for things continuing the way that they are, because change, and particularly radical change, is scary, and it might not work. And if we haven't seen it work, it's harder to imagine that it will. That said, I think self-consciously liberal values, so someone who thinks of themselves, I am a liberal, and these are the principles of it, is definitely it's among people who are more educated, people who are wealthier, you're going to find that, than like uneducated peasants, say. But I think it's very present in like a more innate level. Everybody feels the hurt of being dominated. Everybody feels the hurt of being poor. Production and trade are just, they're everywhere. I think we had a talk at MPS yesterday on liberal heroes, and one of the presentations was on a Nigerian businessman who attempted to liberalize. And it was pointed out he had come from these poor merchants, people who were growing crops, selling them, and so on. And they were all on board. Like, they could see, if I have my good, I'm making this stuff on my small farm, I want to be able to sell it. Like, I can see very clearly I'm the person who is suffering under these regulations. And they might not have thought of themselves as liberals, right? Or seen this as part of this broader ideological perspective, but they could feel very clearly, I can get ahead if I'm just free to truck and barter, as Adam Smith said. So I think part of it is being aware that liberalism isn't just self-identified, self-conscious liberalism, but that everyone, even the poorest, even the least educated, have this feeling of, I'd like to be freer than I am.
This might just be like, I'm arguing on the edges here, but I'd still like to get your views on this. So for me, liberalism is, let's say, people having the freedom to pursue whatever they want to pursue, as long as their pursuits don't hurt other people. So putting that in context, if like you were saying, right, certain ideas, let's say selling guns, selling narcotics, or even selling poison, to that effect, what is wrong with it?
So that list is from 4th century BC, northern India, which had, so we might come up with a different list today. But the argument there is these are things that only exist to cause harm. And you might counter, like, I'm selling weapons to like freedom fighters, right? Or most people who consume alcohol, there are lots of people who sell alcohol. Most people who consume it have no problem, they just enjoy a glass of wine, right? And there's nothing wrong with that. So I would frame it more as, like, at the very least, like, not direct harm. And so fraud, like if I am selling baby formula that's laced with poison, right? Like it's not, the people buying it aren't buying it because they think it's poison. And if I'm selling guns to the oppressive regime, or we have these companies that sell surveillance software to authoritarian regimes, I think we can object to, like, I'm selling this to someone who I know is going to use it to hack the phones of political dissidents so they can be tortured and murdered. That seems bad.
Fraud piece I do agree with, because that's fraud. But on the other side, then you're giving people the opportunity to draw boundaries wherever they see fit, and then the gun guy might feel one person is an oppressor while another producer might feel
Sure.
he's a freedom fighter.
Yeah.
So who's to decide who's who?
There isn't an answer to that, like, because we can always, so first, if we all are those moral philosophers stealing donuts, we can come up with plausible reasons on every side of this. So I think the answer is, if we see activity that we see as immoral, right, we can respond as such. So I'm not saying the state should ban people from selling this stuff, but you can criticize people, and maybe you're wrong to criticize them. There's lots of examples of people getting criticized harshly for reasons that most of us would think were inappropriate. But what that says is that this should be part of, like, a broader conversation that moral activity is messy, moral evaluation is messy. We have people arguing about what counts as moral or how we know for as long as we have records of people arguing. And so I think part of it is just first having this perspective of coming into it with, like, a cleaner, more mindful perspective, watching our own motivations, and then just hoping we get it right and be willing to admit when we got it wrong, and then shying very far away from doing anything that you can't take back, like the state banning things or throwing people in prison or coercive force. That should always be kind of a last resort. But otherwise, I think we just have to admit that we're going to disagree, and and maybe one side's more persuasive than the other, and maybe there are cases where it's much more clear-cut than others, but that's just kind of a fact of this, like, rough and tumble world we find ourselves in. We'll go.
So how does the idea of empathy fit into, like, the principal agency setup that is there in the world? So for example, a buyer and the self-interest of a buyer and a seller are always in collusion with each other. So how would you fit empathy into that?
So I don't think that in a lot of cases the buyer and the seller are really in competition with each. Like, I don't think their self-interests are as in conflict as much as we often think they are.
Yeah, sorry. So it's like always we come up with this price. The
Yeah,
market comes
yeah,
up with this price. But often it happens, it depends on the bargaining power that both the
Yeah.
entities have. So in that sense, I suppose, like, you would increase producer surplus by reducing consumer surplus.
Right. Yeah. I think part of it is a lot would depend on motive. And so if you come into my shop, right, I want to charge, and you're going to buy this, you know, the shirts that I sell in this shop. I want to get as much as I can from that, and you want to pay as little as you can for that shirt. But there's a real difference, I think, between each of us approaching that as still from a position of like friendliness and goodwill towards each other versus like, here's a sucker who just entered my shop and I'm going to try to like screw her over, you know, and which I actually think is you're less likely to get good prices from because you're going to upset your customers and get a reputation for being a jerk, and you know, so I think that again, I mean, to kind of riff off of the prior answer, there's edge cases. There's no clear answer of when it's appropriate to charge what. But I think if we can just interact with each other from this perspective of goodwill and friendliness, and this we see all the time, you know, like the people that you frequent their shop often, they might not know your name, but they smile when they see you, and that smile's genuine. It's not like some faked, you know, I'm just going to smile so this lady will pay a little bit more. It's genuine because we are friendly and social beings, and you develop some degree of care for each other, and so I think it's just, I think issues like you raise kind of work themselves out better if we just come from this position of goodwill and trust, and but you still aren't going to give away a free T-shirt.
But also, oftentimes the price is not really set by the shop that I'm visiting; it's by these companies
Yeah.
that do not have.
Yes, but yes, and that can actually lower like the. I have a friend who works as an accountant, and she has mentioned that things like stealing from customers, so the customer you give them the wrong amount of change, you give them less change than they should have gotten, or stealing from workers, like I'm gonna, you know, you worked 8 hours, but I'm only paying you, your paycheck actually, like I shaved a bit off of it, is much more prevalent in smaller shops where the manager, the person, or the cashier is the one who's also taking home the profits. And so if they give you less change, then they're directly benefiting, versus these big companies, the manager at the huge department store, if he pays his workers what they actually earned or cheats them, it doesn't make any difference to his paycheck, right? It makes a difference to the big corporate profits, but not to him. Or if the cashier gives the wrong change, they're not taking home the contents of the cash drawer at the end of the day. And so that distance actually kind of lessens the incentives to be immoral.
That's why they always give you extra Chipotle for
Yeah, because that person scooping doesn't care at all. I think you had a.
Yeah, first of all, thank you, Aaron, for your session. Very calming, honest, therapeutic, actually. So my question is mostly about, you know, how when we talk about people in the libertarian world, I don't know, it's considered like a phenomenon that all of these people are gonna be like, you know, they wouldn't have empathy, or they'll be like selfish. They come across like those, and a lot of people from different ideologies think that most of the libertarians are like that. But I have found like some of the best people in the libertarian world. I might have like found people who might not be, you know, as just mentioned, it's everywhere. So I just wanted to kind of ask, like, you know, I also do feel that why libertarians are a minority is because we do not connect with people and we are not working on emotions and issues. So I was attending this one of the young scholar session in MPS, and Deirdre McCloskey brought up this factor where she mentioned that
when you're doing a research paper, you're like going forward with anything, it's very important to have empathy and kind of connecting on the grassroots level and with the people's life when you're going out and starting a research. So I feel like, that's what happens with other ideologies or other people or like all our political leaders, that they connect with the masses and they connect with them emotionally. So what are your advice, or like what is your point of view on these aspects of like how we could really make it more empathetic and kind of connect with people so that people just don't think it's elitist or something which they don't identify with?
Yeah. Years ago, when President Barack Obama was going to overhaul the U.S. healthcare system, or the way that healthcare was paid for, I saw someone sent me a clip from a news show where a relatively prominent person within the American libertarian movement was being interviewed about this, and someone said, he is going to, one of the things that Barack Obama wants to do is make sure that everyone can get health insurance even if they can't afford it, and not deny people coverage who have pre-existing conditions. So you have some chronic illness, the insurance company wants nothing to do with you. And this libertarian was arguing against this, and there are ways to argue against some of these policies on, economic grounds and so on. But his argument was, we shouldn't be subsidizing people who made bad choices that got them sick. So if you have cancer, that's your fault, and we should just let you suffer the consequences. And it was hard to sit through, because I could just I was like, he's just doing so much more damage to the cause by just this kind of callous, non-empathetic approach. Deirdre's a model of how to do this well. I really think that a lot of it, there is a problem among libertarians of grounding libertarianism in this attitude of like, what's mine is mine and you can't take it from me. And that matters, right? Like, we should care about not taking, but starting from there, part of this is, I think, the influence of Ayn Rand, but starting from there is not persuasive to a lot of people. And so I always think cultivating, at first, you can't fake empathy. People can tell when you're faking it pretty quickly. So cultivating like an actual attitude of empathy and viewing this as the reason that I am a liberal is not because I think liberalism will make me richer or wealthier. In fact, a lot of very rich people, if we had a genuinely free market, would be a lot less rich than they are now. A lot of people who are very high status right now who say that they're liberals would be lower status in a genuinely liberal society. And so I think a real commitment to this is like, this matters and is important, is worth doing, even if I'm not the person who wins out in this. Even if dynamism and diversity and markets mean that I'm a little bit worse off by giving freedom to everyone else, and that the reason that this matters and we should fight for it is because the people who are actually, I'm a fairly privileged guy who's fairly comfortable, right? But I'm not the one who needs liberty. I mean, I do, right? Like, I would not want to give it up, but it's not, it's the people who are genuinely suffering, genuinely feeling the boot of the state on their neck, genuinely can't earn a living, who need liberty the most. And our arguments have to start with just caring about them and saying, the reason this matters is because the people who are hurting most will benefit the most from it.
And how do we kind of define to create a thin, fine line between altruism and the things which you're talking about? Because a lot of times when you're talking with objectivists, they'll be like, okay, this is something which is leaning towards altruism, but I know like it's not. not like we're sacrificing anything. So how to make that argument like clear when you're talking about these aspects?
Generosity is not sacrifice. And in fact, being generous is, we know lots of psychological data on this, but it's, we don't need the psychological data to know it's true. Acts of generosity make you feel better and happier. So I think it's wrong to frame helping as self-sacrifice. It's wrong to frame someone who genuinely dedicates their lives to others as a sucker. And that doesn't mean that we should then demand everybody give up everything for, but that's the line that I would draw, is the thing that like Arandian is objecting to is kind of the demand at the social or state level that everybody just give up everything they have for, but that doesn't mean that it's not the people who do give of themselves dramatically aren't admirable. And I think that's the perspective that we should take. Yes?
Yeah, I just want to augment to the discussion. I think it goes to the first question she asked also about don't tell a hungry person to meditate. So William Easterly, in one of his books where he criticizes technocratic development, I think he cites a survey on what do poor people want, right?
Yeah.
And they try to ask poor people about what liberty means to you, what democracy means to you, and they in fact had the same answers that the top 10% of the population in every country had. So I think going back to her empathy question, when socialistic, these multilateral agencies which try to come in with the ambit of developing the nation, I think it sounds very altruistic and empathetic because they are saying, okay, we are lifting you from poverty, but at what cost? You don't go to an individual's liberty level there. You don't think about the rights of an individual. You only think about the right of the nation as a whole. And that sort of leads to an imbalance. In fact, liberals think about the right of every individual, whether it's poor or a rich person. So I think that is sort of a disconnect that exists.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, we care about the individuals. We can't always act on that, but yeah. Yeah.
I'd love to get your view on another way of approaching Buddhism, which is more popular or easily accessible, which should fall under the free your mind banner, which would be that a lot of people in Silicon Valley would find it easy to experiment with substances, and they would ingrain that or put that into the practice. So, and I totally understand there is a liberal approach towards how we're thinking from the moral ground these things. It could be that one doesn't do just one way of going about it. There could be a lot of depth in the other practice too. But just to get your view on their approach.
So using, like, say, psychedelics, sure. So if you talked to say like a Theravadan Buddhist monk and asked them that question, they're going to say absolutely not, right? But I think it's important, the fifth precept, don't take intoxicants, is don't take intoxicants that cause heedlessness. Buddhist monks drink a lot of caffeine. Tea is, and that's a drug, but it's one that does the opposite of, at least until you are so addicted to it that it doesn't have an effect on you anymore. And so to the extent that there are tools for deepening or accelerating meditative practice, I don't think there's anything wrong with experimenting with those. I would say, though, that this is the goal of this is a shift in perspective and values, and that doesn't happen quickly. And so my concern with some of that experimentation is not that it's wrong to experiment with things that are available to us, but rather in a lot of the cases, and I think this is very much the case sometimes in Silicon Valley, the goal is not meditative absorption. The goal is ethics and has to start with ethics. Buddhist training starts, there's a reason it starts with the precepts versus find 15 minutes on a cushion every day. And so if you are simply trying to succeed in meditation without it being about redirecting your values and perspective in a more ethical direction, then you've kind of missed the point. And I think a lot of the people in Silicon Valley who do this they're looking for ways to be more productive, right? To hack their mornings, to have more focus for the grind, and so on, versus I want to be more ethical, and so they're using it for the wrong thing.
Another question. I think another difficult thing to resolve is just to understand how empathy itself could be a cause of suffering. So for a lot of people, if they care about something deeply and they sort of find empathy in that person doing something wrong, and having no control over it, or not being able to change it, or being able to persuade them, is something which could cause a loop of suffering in itself. And at some point of time, there has to be some kind of a resolution. What is the right balance between it? I don't know what the answer is. I'm not even framing a question, but just to get your reflection on where does that sort of meander in.
Yeah, I think there's like obsession with empathy or making yourself miserable by kind of taking on the suffering of others and dwelling on it. I would say is not skillful use, because the reason that we do this is to alleviate suffering for ourselves and others. And so if instead your kind of misuse or unskillful use or application of empathy is making you miserable while not helping anyone else, then it's not skillful. And what matters is the skillfulness. Is this wholesome or is it unwholesome? And what you've described is like an unwholesome use of empathy. And so either figure out how to have a more healthy feeling of it, or figure out how to channel that commitment to empathy into ways that are actually